So what's behind the power of the peroxide-based whitening, and how do hydrogen peroxide toothpaste actually whiten teeth, including Colgate's bold claim of removing 15 years of stains? Alongside Tami, I'm Dr. Rob, and you're listening to the Dental Formulators Playbook.
So before we begin, how does whitening work?
Well, to understand whitening, first you have to understand staining. This usually falls into two categories. Intrinsic means something within the enamel itself, could be superficial, maybe even a little bit deeper, as well as extrinsic, which refers to the stubborn protein-rich pellicle that resides on the enamel surface and readily collects dietary or treatment-based chromogen. So this could be anything from like tannins, pigments, as well as even some topical agents, like if you were to use acetylpyridinium chloride mouthwash, or if you were to have a stannous fluoride toothpaste. But from the dietary components, like these tannins and stuff, usually they involve the polyphenols, and polyphenols have a double bond. And that's going to become pretty important to be able to target. We're not going to talk about that too much in this one. We'll talk about that in a future episode, but still, the peroxide is going to emphasize that double bond in these polyphenols.
Okay, so what about natural or medicine-induced discolorations of the tooth? Like some medicines like tetracycline, which is an antibiotic that may lead to gray, yellow, brown stains in kids with developing permanent teeth. Can these be removed?
Yeah, so these fall into the intrinsic category and are more challenging to remove. Iodine-based topicals, for instance, maybe like a povidone iodine or a silver diamine fluoride, which leaves a black, well, deposit in the demineralized tooth if that was used. Sometimes that can influence intrinsic staining. In our next episode, we'll address a more invasive technique that might address this, but toothpaste and topical treatments, no, those are mostly for extrinsic stains and maybe some superficial intrinsic staining. It depends on the biology of the teeth, the nature of the stain, and so on.
So how does hydrogen peroxide work?
Well, in short, because the pellicle is constructed, well, of proteins, and since hydrogen peroxide can work with some proteins, as well as the double bonds from the polyphenols, the hydrogen peroxide is going to react with these things, with the amino acids in the pellicle layer, as well as the polyphenols that are contained also within that pellicle layer. So, in doing so, free radicals are formed, as well as some ions, and that will be generated both at and within the tooth structure. These species will degrade the pellicle, also the chromogen, as we just talked about, but they may also impact the soft tissue. In fact, the generation of free radicals may impart potential cyto-based safety concerns.
Okay, well, sometimes blue light is sold with hydrogen peroxide kits. How does this work? Or
Yeah,
does this work?
yeah, it does work actually. It just excites the hydrogen peroxide molecule more quickly than if you were just to wait for it to degrade on its own. So blue light definitely works, violet's even better. Okay. And that light readily shifts and creates all those radicals and ions and for the improved reaction. Yep, definitely a benefit.
Okay, so hydrogen peroxide is used primarily then for extrinsic staining, but people are looking for other non-peroxide solutions.
Yes, and I can certainly understand that. That will be addressed in the next episodes. In the meantime, there are two major drawbacks to peroxide-based whitening, and usually that involves maybe some sensitivity and or some enamel softening. To address these drawbacks, manufacturers may add to both over-the-counter or professional systems, like the carbamide or their hydrogen peroxide gels having at least 10%, sometimes up to 35% gels. Sometimes they may add potassium nitrate, fluoride salts, maybe calcium phosphate salts, or even minerals, and or some kind of combination of those.
Okay, does that work?
Well, sensitivity can be reduced, but not always, and the same thing with the softening of the enamel surface. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and this is always because of just the inherent variations in the biology of somebody's mouth. What about the tooth? What about the stain? In fact, those variations, the salivary rate you have, the pH that you have, your dietary regimens, what you're eating, all of these kinds of things, all of that influences it. If you're going to be talking about trying to get whitening from just a hydrogen peroxide kind of treatment, you might want to think about other things too that can maybe help boost that, because maybe because of all these difficulties or whatever, hydrogen peroxide alone may not be the only answer.
Okay, so how effective are peroxide toothpaste relative to like a high peroxide gel?
Yeah, so OTC versus the professional, right?
Yes.
That's a good question. We're going to be talking about a research study that actually addressed that very question. So stay tuned for that. But the spoiler alert is that the higher content typically, well, conveys the better benefit.
Okay, so what's in a peroxide-based toothpaste and how can it get the teeth whiter?
Right. So let's consider an example here. And you know, I looked at the Colgate. Colgate has a lot of different over-the-counter whitening products, and they have a toothpaste, and they have a 5% hydrogen peroxide containing toothpaste called Colgate Optic White Pro Series, which also claims whitening and stain prevention. In fact, it says it can remove 15 years worth of stains. Now, we're going to be talking about this, but for the record, I'm not trying to demonize or trumpet this product. Okay. I just want to give a perspective. And assuming this review is real and legit, I think it serves to represent the toothpaste fairly well as some of the advantages and maybe pitfalls of a whitening based product. So here it is. The review posted about a year ago under the reviewer's name, I guess, R Guys 4, and he gave it four, or she gave it 4 out of 5 stars with the title, quote, powerful whitening strength. But the first sentence tells you what you need to know. Quote, this toothpaste is not for people who have mouth sensitivities.
Wow.
The review continues. It is a truly powerful toothpaste that will help make them brighter. However, if you have sensitive gums, it can sting a little while you are using the product.
That's telling. So it works, but it might hurt.
Exactly.
Okay, so do you think the sensitivity is related then to the peroxide or something else?
Well, I think the formulation itself has some issues, good or bad, right? It's not going to be just the 5% hydrogen peroxide. It can, although hydrogen peroxide, of course, can have, it can lead to some irritations and maybe some sensitivities. The OTC monograph for topical hydrogen peroxide for antiseptics has limits of 3.5%. So this one has like a 5% hydrogen peroxide. So, there could be some issues there.
Okay, so what does the Optic White toothpaste have then?
Well, let's take a look. And I recognize several of these ingredients because they will impact both the tooth whitening aspect as well as stain removal, the latter of which was really claimed by the product.
So more than just hydrogen peroxide.
Absolutely. You can't really get stain prevention benefits from just hydrogen peroxide. So you can get stain removal, but they're also talking about stain inhibition or prevention. You can't get that only with hydrogen peroxide.
Okay, so tell me.
So let's look. Again, actual content may not be shared of exactly how much of each of these ingredients. Why? Well, that's a trade secret. And obviously that's not meant to be shared. But for marketing purposes, sometimes it is. So this paste is a clear example of that. First, there is only one active ingredient in this toothpaste. Do you know what it is?
Well, this is about whitening, so I would think hydrogen peroxide.
Nope, incorrect. Wrong.
Wait,
what? The active ingredient they are claiming is sodium monofluorophosphate.
Ah, so this would fall under the OTC anti-caries monograph.
Exactly. It's probably telling that they're using MFP. That must mean that there might be a calcium abrasive in there as well. Right?
But I thought this was a whitening toothpaste.
Well, it is. It is. But remember, there is no monograph for whitening. Whitening is a cosmetic claim. Stain prevention is a cosmetic claim. There is a monograph to claim hydrogen peroxide for antiseptic benefits, but like I mentioned before, that's limited to 3.5% and should be supported with data. However, this paste isn't making an antiseptic claim.
Oh.
And it's not making any anti-plaque or anti-gingivitis claims.
Okay, I see. So this ties into our prior episodes, number 3 and 4, on fluoride in the intro to FDA.
Exactly. And that means that in this case, they're not considering hydrogen peroxide to be an active ingredient of any kind.
Okay, so what are the other ingredients then?
Well, we have the MFP, the sodium MFP, and that is the active ingredient. They're claiming that obviously for caries, right? OTC. But we have some other ingredients in there too. And these are, well, at least the first one is pretty familiar to everybody. I mean, propylene glycol, that is typically added for rheology or viscosity purposes. Sometimes that can have some solubilizer effects depending on what the flavor is in terms of getting the oils to be folded into the water-based
Hmm.
formulation. Calcium pyrophosphate. So this is probably the first time that we're talking about this, and that is in this product. It is an insoluble system. And this is really important as pyrophosphates are key for stain prevention. In case Colgate is using an insoluble pyro, this will also impart some abrasive effects and properties. And in fact, based on where it is in the ingredient listing, I think this might be the primary abrasive material in this product.
Okay.
PVP, that stands for polyvinyl pyrrolidone. This is a loaded one. So this is a film forming polymer, but can also be used to help stabilize hydrogen peroxide.
What do you mean stabilize?
Well, the PVP can actually help prevent premature degradation of the hydrogen peroxide while it's in the formulation.
Okay, so is this why topical solutions of hydrogen peroxide are often sold in dark containers?
Yeah, so that's a problem. Light is a problem, especially UV light. And so they'll, you know, prevent or reduce the amount of degradation of the peroxide molecule. You put it in a dark container, blocks out the light. PVP is also going to have some protective effects like that. Interestingly, there are different types of PVP. And although Colgate doesn't specify which one they're using, and again, probably for trade secret purposes, we can imagine maybe which one it is. So let's talk about the first type. The first type is just the linear chain version. It's readily soluble in water, and this is simply referred to as povidone. So an ingredient, you see povidone, that's just referring to a type of, well, PVP, water soluble one. This may be very familiar to those who know about povidone iodine treatments. For instance, there is the monograph for antimicrobial benefits of the povidone iodine system. But you may also find this in Alka-Seltzer tablets, where clear disintegration is desired. In contrast to that, in one that maybe isn't completely soluble, you have a cross-link version of PVP, and this is called cross-povidone. Probably easier to see, right? Cross-link, povidone.
Yeah.
That's just the way it is, right? The cross-linking in this case renders it less likely to be soluble, and it allows the formulation that contains it to swell. So if it's not going to disintegrate into nothing, then it's going to absorb the moisture and maybe give it some body. Maybe it can act kind of like a binder. Maybe give it some, I don't know, some rheology modifying properties. But it tends to be implemented in those types of formulations where disintegration doesn't matter. And it's mostly for these things that are going to be ingested. So if you put a lingual in your mouth, mint in your mouth, or if you take an antibiotic, an antibiotic medicine or any kind of other topical medicine that needs to disintegrate quickly, and you swallow it and it gets in your stomach, you don't care if there's
Mhm.
any residue, right? So that's where that's typically added. Yeah, so they both can provide, dispersion of the other active ingredients or other maybe inactive ingredients where and when possible.
Okay, so while both can provide disintegration properties, usually povidone, if I'm saying that correctly,
Yep.
povidone is used where residue free might matter, while cross povidone is used if residue isn't enough or is a non-factor.
Yeah, that's right. And now what is left unspoken is that the cross provolone may have some synergies with some of the other ingredients,
Oh,
especially with peroxides.
okay.
So, but let's turn to the other ingredients. There's block copolymer or some kind of combination polymer, PEG and PPG. They call it 116/66, and they call it a copolymer. That's usually used for, again, solubilizing viscosity, rheology purposes, maybe some surfactant purposes as well to help distribute, the active. It's also a water-based system, aqueous system. Yeah, that's not really unusual, right? So this
Right.
one has water. They do list that they have 5% hydrogen peroxide. Stating that exact level is likely done for marketing purposes and or otherwise differentiating among other products because there's other toothpaste that have 4% or maybe even their own products because they have like 3.5% or 3%. I know that they had 1.5% at some point, as well as others. So for them saying 5%, I think that that's pretty important because from a technology point of view too, to be able to protect it from disintegrating prematurely, or I should say degrading prematurely, that could be one of the benefits. They also have silica in there. Again, abrasive properties too, even though I believe that calcium pyros do most of that work. They have flavor, and that flavor represents an umbrella of other ingredients that are going
Hmm.
to, lead to whatever that profile is. Sodium lauryl sulfate, they have this, and sodium lauryl sulfate works really well with most polymer systems. And I think it's a wise choice. If foams really well, it has good agreement with the other inactive ingredients, and it can also help deliver even the active ingredient like fluoride even a bit better. Some people might disagree because they have sensitivities. That's fine, but SLS is really quite good. There's also two soluble pyrophosphates. So in addition to the calcium pyro, we have two other pyros that they're putting in here.
Okay.
They have a tetrasodium pyro and then a disodium pyro.
So why these two?
These will help with stain prevention.
Ah,
In fact, these can impart anti-tartar benefits as well.
okay. So, but both, it takes both of them?
Well, they're probably putting in both of these for a balance of mouthfeel
Okay.
and solubility and cleaning purposes and stain prevention. So I think that it's going to have all of these kinds of properties. The sodium is going to be more soluble than like the disodium will be more soluble than the tetrasodium. Both should dissolve, but depending on the level used, they may not all completely dissolve. And
Oh,
so,
okay. Well, we formulated with the tetrasodium before, correct? If I remember correctly, it's really gritty. It's hard to get it to fully dissolve.
yeah, it can be if you use higher levels. And so,
Okay.
depending on what levels they're using, I'm not exactly sure there. Yes, that can impart some of the grittiness. In fact, some of the other people that were reviewing this product noted that it was gritty. It was a little bit gritty, and that could be mostly coming from the calcium pyro, but sometimes the tetra can also impart that as well.
Okay.
They also have sucralose, regarded as E955 in the European Union if it's on a label there. But as probably most people know here, if you're talking about a sweetener like this or whatever, it's 600 times sweeter than sugar. Sometimes that's especially useful in formulations that are very bitter or that have other agents that are just really hard to mask. If you can't mask it in the flavor system that you have, then put in a little bit more sweetener. And so I think that this is one of the reasons why it's used.
Okay.
And then lastly, BHT, which stands for butylate hydroxytoluene. You won't see this in too many formulations, although it may help prevent discoloration, maybe helps with preservation, kind of like EDTA, one of our other episodes where we talked about
Okay.
that. Here, it's unique because the BHT helps prevent also premature degradation of the peroxide molecule.
Uh,
So BHT and PVP really go hand in hand with hydrogen peroxide formulations, whether especially if you're going to have a toothpaste, but it probably wouldn't be too surprising to see these ingredients in a pen or in a gel, just because it can help prolong the lifetime of the hydrogen peroxide. For those systems that have carbamide peroxide, they don't have to worry about that as much. Carbamide peroxide takes a little longer to dissolve. It's already in a more protected
okay.
form, really. You can still have the BHT and the PVP. It's not going to hurt it, but that's what's going on there.
Okay. So we've talked about all the ingredients. What about the pH?
Yeah, you know what? Whenever I first looked at this, I was guesstimating that based on the ingredients that it has, I was figuring that it was going to be at least around maybe 7,
Okay.
definitely higher than 6. Maybe it could push alkaline. But the paper that we're going to talk about that was published in 2024, they actually evaluated this exact toothpaste and they measured it to be 7.9. So again, I'm not surprised. This is a more alkaline based system. Alkaline based systems work really well in terms of trying to get the peroxide to do the work. So
Okay.
although some systems may start acidic, when put into the mouth, which is more alkaline anyway, then the peroxide is going to be able to do its work. There's reasons why you would use acids and, or have a more acidic, kind of a product. We won't go into that here, but that this is an alkaline based one, it probably is more of a reflection of the other ingredients. really, than trying to make sure that we have peroxide available in the mouth right away.
Okay, so you mentioned the study. So is there anything else about this paste?
Yeah, so I think that the stain prevention and whitening, and based on the ingredients, I think it's going to have some abrasive properties too. And I think we need to address that first. So before we start talking about that 2024 study and hey, does it whiten? How does it whiten versus the 10% carbamide gel versus other paste? We need to talk about this. So, this ingredient, or I mean, this product has several of those ingredients that, well, I mean, they're going to clean pretty well.
Okay, so just like good cleaning agents can be hard on the skin, perhaps the combination of peroxide and these ingredients may contribute to mouth sensitivities that have been reported, like in the review.
Exactly. And so, even some people posted a question about this. I think it was on Amazon. They said, hey, somebody that was familiar, maybe they saw something called an RDA.
Maybe a competitor.
Maybe a competitor. They said, hey, yeah, that's true. They said, what's the RDA? And Colgate responded just generally and said, well, it's less than 200.
Okay, which, first of all, that's vague, but someone that's unfamiliar with this doesn't tell me a whole lot. So tell me more about what less than 200 RDA means.
Yeah, so let's talk about RDA. So that's a measurement that is more or less, well, it's been standardized, usually by those bigger players and that have been in the industry field forever, and they work with all the different researchers and even independently right outside the company walls, and they work with leading universities. And there's been several standard ways of measuring what this relative dentin abrasion
RDA,
really is,
okay.
the RDA. And so now there's like exact methods that you can find them in the ISO 11609 or ADA procedures that outline how they measure this. One is a radio tracer method, another one is profilometry.
So it's been standardized.
It has been standardized and accepted. That's right. So, okay. But first, the important thing to know is that it refers to the abrasion, right, or the aggressiveness of dental abrasives relative to a standard, because you always have to have some kind of thing, some kind of baseline to compare it to.
Right.
And what they did is they used a calcium pyro, just like the same ingredient that Colgate's using in this peroxide. Okay. And so they typically, have this baseline be of calcium pyro, maybe around a 20% or so composition, just a generic abrasive system, and then they make their measurements. As you may recall, the dentin, that's the underlying, layer of an enamel. So you have a cavity, then the decay penetrated deep enough into the enamel that now it's starting to get into the dentin or has already gotten to the dentin. Okay. And then it's a problem. Once it gets into the dentin, then you're stuck. While you have some decay in the enamel, as long as it's not too deep, like it's not too close to that enamel dentin junction, it can be remineralized. It can be healed, but you need some good topicals and stuff. Okay. You need a good, approach. But then, and you need a little bit of luck, because if your teeth are just not going to be able to withstand that, your biology or whatever, or your diet or whatever conditions, there's so many mitigating factors, right, then that's what's going to happen. But the dentin, so that's the underlying structure, that is weaker than enamel. And it acts as like a shock absorber. Like if you were to bite something, right? You don't have it's not just you have your skull and your jaw and your enamel tooth and everything's just all solid. The dentin is a little bit softer. It has collagen in there, so there's a lot of organic content. It is a mineralized structure as well, but that one, and that's why everybody refers to what is the RDA score, because that is the softer material. Okay. Aside from the gums that you have in your cheek and the tongue and things like that in your mouth, when we're talking about the actual tooth structure, that's the one that would be more susceptible to abrasion. And so it makes sense to have products, evaluated based on that material, right? It's the weakest of the
right. So it makes sense. You mentioned the scores then that, and Colgate suggested it's less than 200, which again is not. That's vague. What does that mean?
Yeah, 200. Well, let's give some ranges here. So typically, if you have between 0 and 60, that will obviously have the least amount of abrasion. That would be the least damaging to the dentin. So if somebody has exposed tooth root from receding gums, or they have other mitigating factors again, and they need something super gentle, well, they would typically look for products between 0 and 60, right? Like water would be essentially 0, like, I guess, you know what I mean?
Makes sense.
So some gel formulations as well, including the peroxide gel formulations, like if you just have like a carbamide or hydrogen peroxide gel, that's going to be really low too. Between 60 and 120, there will be various abrasives that convey some gentle cleaning benefits. This may include some calcium carbonate. You might have some clays, including bentonite, maybe Fuller's Earth, maybe kaolin. There's some different things there, as well as a variety of silicas. Silicas dominate this category currently just because there are so many different dental type of silicas. You have the thickening and you have the polishing, and the polishing ones can be made at all different sizes that can affect the RDA score. So they can either be super gentle or they can be super aggressive. And so it's going to be easy. So you'll see silicas all over the place. There's not just one type of silica. And so, anybody familiar with formulating will know that there's options to choose from. Same is especially true with the silicas, and the companies that make them actually submit their silicas for testing, to understand, well, we make all these silicas, where are we at? So from a formulation perspective, that can be discussed, companies with the formulators and everything else. But calcium pyro would probably fall in and around 120 area. Probably some of the nano hydroxyapatite that we talked about previously, that might even fall in there as well. Could even be even more gentle, could be, especially if it's low loading. And if you have, well, the smallest particle sizes, that could be really low. If you get between 120 then and 250, 250 is the maximum that they say is for safety.
Okay, so saying under 200 doesn't leave much of a margin.
Yeah, no, it really doesn't.
250 is the max.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, those that are going up to 250, or those that are going to be especially between 200 and 250, those are going to be ones with more challenging stains, tobacco stains, smoking stains. Maybe you have intrinsic staining that you're just really trying to get. Maybe you had too many blue, dummy dum pops or something, and maybe we're just really trying to get that blue out. I don't know, but yeah, usually that would be a pretty aggressive system. So
okay, so again, the Colgate product stated it's less than 200, which is again vague. It leaves a very very narrow window. But they do have this information, right? Like they know what this for is.
Yep. They're just not letting you know, which is fine. I mean, they don't have to. That's their prerogative. I would say it's at least 120 though, based on the calcium pyro score.
Okay.
So and based on the calcium pyro content, assuming that it's maybe at least 20%. Again, we don't know. They haven't published it, but with the other pyros, they still have silica in here. I think that you're going to be at least at 120. You're going to want good stain prevention, good stain removal. You're not going to get it all done with hydrogen peroxide. That can be expedited by some of these other ingredients. So it has to be a little bit abrasive.
That's very telling. I guess when it came to whitening and hydrogen peroxide, I always thought that would be the end all be all, but it sounds like there's a lot of other ingredients that matter.
Yeah, not only the ingredients, the particle size too, and the loading, And so like if you have like a 70% particle size, the RDA will increase accordingly, And if you reduce that, the converse is then true. It can be super gentle. So you can either have a fine particle at 70% loading. You might think, well, okay, that's kind of silly. Who would do that? Even some of the sodium bicarbonate toothpastes they will have at least 50%, maybe even 65%. That may seem like it's too high and you'll have a super high RDA, but if the primary abrasive is baking soda, and again, we'll talk about that in a future episode, it can still be very gentle.
So depending upon particle size and loading levels, something that could or that is gentle could become too abrasive.
Absolutely.
If it's high enough, basically loaded in.
Yep, and it's all about the properties of the abrasive. Is it even partially soluble in water, like baking soda is? And baking soda is definitely soluble. Are the silica, abrasive soluble? No. So and then you have all those different ones. So yeah, so it could be crazy. But
we talked about Denton.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so what about enamel? Why is Denton used over enamel when you said the RDA score? Is there a comparable REA score?
Yeah, there is. But the REA, again, like we talked about, that's less susceptible to getting eroded or worn away.
Because it's harder than the Denton.
Yep. So, the REA scores are important, but everybody looks at the RDA. I mean, that's just industry wide.
Okay. So how well a toothpaste or gel cleans is always given by the RDA.
Actually, no. So the RDA is only talking
Okay.
about safety, right? And how gentle it is. Is it going to pose any risks, right? You need
Of
another
course you
test to
do.
talk about how clean it is, and that's called the pellicle cleaning ratio or the PCR test.
Okay. So another acronym. So RDA, REA, FDA, ADA, ISO. My goodness.
Right? I know it's like a central government body dishing out all these codes.
Oh.
By the way, there's still more codes, with other evaluations.
Okay. So the last one you mentioned, PCR.
PCR.
That is for cleaning. How does that compare then with RDA?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because those pastes that are the safest, the ones that have the lowest RDA score, they may not be the best at cleaning. So that is something.
It's gonna say.
Yeah, just because it's safe doesn't mean that it's going to clean the best.
Okay.
In fact, creating a toothpaste with a superior cleaning while maintaining a very low safety risk profile, that is a great avenue of research and opportunity. And anybody who's looking for that kind of concept, or looking into that kind of research, that's a big one. And
It sounds like it'd be difficult to achieve.
it can be, and again, maybe it's not just a physical kind of removal. Maybe you want the chemical also, but there's opportunities that exist, and people have been working really well at that. So
Okay.
so you have this cleaning, but how do you measure it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the PCR is determined based on the familiar C lab color space parameters. You'll have like the L star, the A star, the B star parameters, right? And the L star corresponds to the lightness or brightness, and L star, that corresponds to the greenness or redness, and the B star is the yellowness or the blueness of the tooth. And then of course you can put all these together to make an E variable, and you always have to do it relative to what did you start with? What was your color space of your darkened enamel before it was white? So then you get delta, L or delta A, the change in something. And then you have the delta E. And some people even prefer to use the delta W, which talks specifically to the whiteness. And it's based on an empirical calculation where you have an equation that utilizes only the L star and maybe the A star components. I know it sounds crazy, but really it's pretty sensible because you have these quantifiable,
That is
metrics,
good.
and that can be mapped to shades. And so all the spectrophotometers, if you're looking at something from a whitening perspective, they can map that. So you can know what your shade differences are and
Quantitative.
stuff. It is quantitative, and it allows then you to know how effective your product is. So
Okay. So determining the tooth color helps define the cleaning capability
yes,
then of the product. So based on this reasoning, any observed cleansing effect is based on physical scrubbing, chemical action, or a combination of these two.
yeah, that's right. And the Colgate Optic White Pro Series is relying both on the physical scrubbing. I'm assuming it's coming from the calcium pyro, especially, as well as the 5% peroxide. Otherwise, for instance, if a product just had some silica in it, it would only be focusing on just the physical only, and it would, all of these products are going to be able to generate their own unique L star, A star, and B star.
Okay, got it.
So in fact, PCR and RDA, because they're super important, right? You want the safety, you want the cleaning,
Right.
to be, well, acceptable, right? And then minimum acceptable, robust if you really can get a good product. Sometimes it's easier to talk about the CEI or the cleaning efficiency index.
Another
So
acronym.
another acronym, yeah, it's back here.
Okay, so what is that?
This was based on a lot of the different toothpastes that were used with the different abrasive systems. An empirical equation was developed, and they said, hey, okay, we'll have this equation and it automatically assigns a PCR level of 50 based on the clinical outcomes for acceptable cleaning of a toothpaste. And so that is like, the 50 is used in this equation. We're not presenting it here.
Okay, so it's just standard.
It's just a standard.
Okay.
It's not complicated actually at all.
Okay, so for a whitening only product, like a 10% hydrogen peroxide gel or pen, would the PCR still be used?
Yeah, absolutely. And it typically is, in fact. So if you have a whitening study and you have it done, wherever, like if you have things tested at Intertech or the School of Dentistry, Indiana University or whoever's doing this, right? They would probably use a spectrophotometer, maybe that has the All-Star, maybe it has shade guides, things like that. They would use stained tooth specimens. They would do the experiments looking at that. So,
Okay, so was the Colgate Optic White Pro Series evaluated?
yeah, it was. And so, we're talking about that 2024 research paper, and we're going to talk about it in just a minute. But I'm sure Colgate had their own internal data that they use to try to make that bold claim of, hey, we can remove 15 years of accumulated stain. I mean, that's
Yeah,
that
years is
to
interesting.
me, that's bold because I mean, teeth are again huge variation, diet, all this stuff. What types of stains are you talking about, right?
And how deep are you going?
How deep are you going, right? So, I mean, that's a marketing claim, bold claim. It's a cosmetic claim. So the cosmetic claims can get really, really bold. Anyway, this paper from this research group in Brazil, published in 2024, they looked at a 3% hydrogen peroxide toothpaste, 4% and 5% toothpaste, and a 10% carbamide peroxide gel, as well as a negative control. In my view, this was a really good study because they had, the high end with the 10%, they had the low end with the zero, and then they had some intermediate stuff. They didn't know exactly what to find, but they wanted to look at both the whitening efficacy as well as the permeability of the peroxide to get deeper into the tooth, which I think is interesting.
Okay, so if the peroxide penetrates into the tooth, that makes me think it could bear on sensitivity then, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So what they're looking for, one of the drawbacks is the inflammation that can result by the cells that reside within that tooth structure, right? Especially within that pulp chamber. So, that is one way where the radical approach that are often generated from the peroxide. You can get ions or radicals. The radicals can really just antagonize some of those cells.
Okay, so is that what they think the sensitivities arise from peroxide? Is that why it is?
Yeah, potentially. There's some other factors too, but and obviously that's why maybe potassium nitrate isn't the only solution, right? So although potassium nitrate does work for sensitivity, if you're having cells that are having some kind of inflammatory response, it may not be enough, right? It all depends on the sensitivity. So that's just another way.
Okay, so what they find then?
Well, first, they did measure the pH of that toothpaste and found it above 7.5. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The 3% that they evaluated, that was also a Colgate product that also had an alkaline pH. It was above 7.5. The carbamide gel, 10%, and the 4% hydrogen peroxide toothpaste. Those were more acidic. And the toothpaste that had the 4%, that's a Procter and Gamble product. They noticed that the viscosity of that particular product it flowed way easier, more like a gel, actually. And the toothpastes for the 3 and 5% were definitely more viscous. So yeah, it was pretty interesting, but I think that's going to be kind of telling, right? If you have something that's a little bit more viscous, might that have more penetration into the tooth?
Okay, so the 10% whiten the best.
Yes, it did in that study, absolutely.
Okay, followed by the 5% hydrogen peroxide toothpaste. So what about the depth of peroxide penetration?
Yeah, the one that penetrated the most was the 4%. The 4% acidic toothpaste, the one that was marketed by Procter and Gamble. Again, not trying to, trumpet or demonize any of these, but that's just what it was. And the 10% gel, even though that was also acidic, the 4% penetrated 20 times more so than the 10%.
Wow.
And the 3 and 5%, they were basic, they had higher viscosities. They did penetrate into the chamber too, with the lower concentration, but only 10 times as much, not 20 times as much.
As the gel.
As the gel. So that's right.
So the 3% and 5% had about half the penetration of the 4% paste.
Yep.
And despite having the 10% of peroxide.
Yep.
Okay. It penetrated the least. That's interesting. A little confusing because it's the higher content that sometimes leads to the sensitivity issues.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? So then it makes you wonder, well, maybe those professional products, maybe the sensitivity mechanism is a little different. You see what I'm saying? So maybe the potassium nitrates work really well there. but maybe if you're actually inflaming cells and stuff,
Okay.
instead of just because, typically how sensitivity works, well, one of the prevailing theories, if you believe the hydrodynamic theory, is that you have fluid that is being moved about and you're having all these different pressure gradients and the nerve is there and it feels that pressure change
Okay.
due to the different stimuli. And so, if you have potassium nitrate, it can get neutralized and that nerve is just, innervated, you know.
Okay.
But if you're actually talking about cells and having that kind of response, well, that's a different mechanism, right? So the authors actually, that paper even said it might be wiser to stick with higher peroxide treatments because they don't penetrate as deeply. And so maybe you're not going to have that inflammatory response. You might have the nerve-based response,
Right.
but that is usually mitigated by the potassium nitrate, for
Okay.
instance, or if you have other ingredients. So that's what they were talking about. They did mention that because people are aggressive with their whitening. And if you brush your teeth the whole way, it's only natural. We look in the mirror, we want to have white teeth. It's only natural. This is just one of the things that people do, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes it's like, well, too much isn't going to be bad, right? Well,
Yeah,
it could
is.
be. Going back to that review, that toothpaste can wreak havoc in your mouth. It can really attack the soft tissue. It can,
Mhm.
the gums are so susceptible to damage, and honestly, that's the biggest risk. Not really the strength of your tooth, so much so, but as we age, our gums start to recede. It exposes more of
Yes.
the tooth. You know, Gingivitis can creep in. I mean,
Okay.
and then that might turn into periodontitis, and then there could be other things. And if you brush too hard, or depending on what you brush with, especially these at-home treatments, which we're going to talk about in a later episode, safety has to be there. But anyway, the whole point is, yeah, in this study, they found that the lower hydrogen peroxide content products penetrated deeper than a professional product. So that's kind of interesting. Now,
And still, though, the 5% did outperform the
it
3 and
did.
4%, which you would expect in terms of whitening.
Yep.
So it does seem to support their whitening claim.
Yeah. Again, the 15 years worth of stains. How can you assess that? They couldn't assess
That
that.
seems weird.
I think that's a bit ambitious. But
Okay, so this episode has been really helpful in understanding some of the key parameters involved in whitening.
yeah, absolutely.
Do you think this is underappreciated?
Yeah, yeah. I do. Outside of the big brand companies that know how to do this, Colgate knows how to do this. Procter & Gamble knows how to do this, right? They're savvy with all of this. But where else are you going to learn about all of these other testings, right? I mean, if you see dentists, sometimes dentists like to get clever and they like to publish, and again, no shade on them. They're just trying to draw attention to the different toothpaste that might have an RDA score, and they're trying to say, hey, look, we're sensitive to this. We know about this. This is one of our angles of showing that we care about the products. And the problem with that is you have to keep updating that because formulations keep on changing. If somebody just takes out 5% of their silica or just change it up by using a different silica, which often happens, then the RDA can completely change. And moreover, it's not just about safety. People aren't going to the dentist for only safety concerns.
Yeah.
They want something fixed and they want something that's going to clean really well. And so the cleaning efficiency index or the PCR scores, those are not published. And so, that's the kind of stuff that even dentists don't know about it. Probably hygienists don't. They may have heard about it, but they don't know about it.
They don't know the intricacies.
They can't give you a number of like, okay, what's Crest Pro Health right now?
Right.
What's the Pronamel, PCR value? Like, it's just not going to happen. They're not going to know. So, any other people that are interested in this, you're going to have to find out by doing your own searches, but you don't know what you don't know, so you have to start to look for it. It's one of the reasons why we're introducing this, right? Say, look, if you have some kind of aspect where you want to create a product or you think you have a great idea or you want to get into the space or you just want to be more knowledgeable as a consumer, where else do you find? Well, I mean, this is part of what this podcast is trying to help you.
Absolutely. There are many ways out there looking for other forms of whitening. There's many people looking for all these forms of whitening. And there's a lot of hacks and whatnot, or at least ways to minimize things.
Absolutely. You know what? We're going to talk about some of these various strategies. We're going to break this into 2 different episodes. And the at-home stuff is going to be in the following episode, I believe,
Okay.
episode 10. But
There's some crazy stuff out
in
there.
episode number 9, we're going to talk about an in-office procedure that might utilize existing over-the-counter, or at least they're marketed as over-the-counter, but maybe they're sold in the professional space, or maybe they just are professional products in order to address how to get some of these trickier stains out. And it involves, well, it involves intervention by your dentist or your hygienist, and it involves etching in the teeth. We will be talking about this, okay?
Okay.
This one goes after it's not so much the extrinsic stains, the ones that can be removed.
Okay.
With
So that's what we talked
peroxide.
about a lot today.
Yeah, it's going to be more of, well, what's your superficial intrinsic stains looking like? So that's coming up in the next episode. In the meantime, alongside Tami, I'm Dr. Rob, and we thank you for listening to the Dental Formulators Playbook. See you next time.
Thank you.